Hey guys, tonight we begin with a story that feels like a fever dream someone had in a smoky basement during the Cold War, so get comfortable, maybe dim the lights, find your favorite blanket, and prepare to drift off to the soothing sound of paranoia, hallucinogens, and government-funded insanity. Because tonight, we're re-exploring how LSD, the chemical that made 1960s hippies see sound and taste colors, started. Its career not at Woodstock, but in a CIA laboratory. Yeah, sleep tight, let's rewind to the late 1940s. The world had just finished one world war and was warming up for the next one, the Cold War. America was tired, suspicious, and just a little bit obsessed with the idea that communists could, at any moment, crawl out from under the bed and hypnotize everyone. And if that sounds paranoid, well, it was, but paranoia was practically a national pastime then. The CIA, still pretty new at the time, was formed in 1947, and like any new government agency, it needed a purpose. Something dramatic. Something to justify the suits, the secrecy, and the absurd budget. And in the early 1950s, that purpose became mind control, because apparently someone decided that instead of trying to understand humans through, say, therapy or education, it might be faster to just chemically reprogram people. You know, like a human software update, but with syringes. So this is where LSD enters the picture. But before the CIA got its hands on it, LSD was the accidental baby of a Swiss chemist named Albert Hofmann. Back in 1938, he was working at a pharmaceutical company called Sandoz Laboratories, trying to create new medicines out of ergot fungus that grows on rye. Which, to be fair, sounds like a solid way to spend a Tuesday if you're a chemist in 1930s Switzerland. Hoffman didn't think much of the substance he made, lysergic acid diethylamide or LSD-25, until 5 years later when he accidentally absorbed a bit through his fingertips. What followed was probably history's first ever accidental acid trip. He felt dizzy, detached, and then experienced what he later described as an uninterrupted stream of fantastic pictures, extraordinary shapes, and intense kaleidoscopic play of colors. In other words, Tuesday got weird. Naturally, this experience piqued his curiosity. So on April 19, 1943, now celebrated by fans of psychedelics as Bicycle Day, Hoffman decided to intentionally take 250 micrograms of LSD, which he thought was a small dose. It wasn't. That's about 10 times what's considered strong today. He then tried to bike home during the trip, and let's just say he wasn't entirely sure if he was moving or if the road was. Meanwhile, his poor lab assistant had to follow him to make sure he didn't end up in a tree. When he got home, Hoffman reported seeing demon-like transformations of the people around him, furniture, breathing, and colors melting. Then, hours later, everything softened, and he felt an overwhelming sense of peace and connection. He realized he'd stumbled upon something enormous, something that could change how humans understood the mind. Sandoz Laboratories was intrigued. They began producing LSD and shipping small quantities to psychiatrists and researchers worldwide. It was marketed under the name De La Soude, and came with a cheerful little instruction sheet suggesting it might help with psychotherapy or, might induce temporary insanity for research purposes. And that last bit caught the attention of some very interested Americans. Let's float over to the early 1950s now. The Korean War was raging, and US soldiers who had been captured sometimes returned home spouting suspiciously pro-communist statements. The government panicked, thinking, oh no, the Reds have figured out mind control. The phrase, brainwashing, hit the headlines, and suddenly everyone in Washington was convinced that the Soviets, the Chinese, and maybe even the Girl Scouts were developing ways to control human thought. So the CIA, being the CIA, decided they needed to catch up or ideally, get ahead. And to do that, they launched one of the strangest and most unethical research projects in modern history, Project MKUltra. Yes, that's the one. The program so wild that it inspired decades of conspiracy theories, weird TV shows, and people insisting fluoride makes you obedient. But back then, it was all very official, funded, documented, and stamped with top-secret approval. At the helm was a man named Sidney Gottlieb, a chemist who looked unassuming enough to sell you vitamins at a pharmacy, but was in fact running a covert operation to chemically break the human mind. He was soft-spoken, had a bit of a limp, and was a fan of meditation and folk dancing. Your average CIA sorcerer. Under Gottlieb's direction, MKUltra explored every possible way to manipulate the human brain: hypnosis, sensory deprivation, electroshock therapy, and, of course, LSD. Lots of LSD. So much LSD that Sandoz Laboratories probably thought America had a nationwide outbreak of depression. The agency bought literally kilograms of the stuff and began dosing pretty much everyone. At first, the experiments were on willing subjects, mostly students, doctors, and scientists who thought they were participating in legitimate research. But then the CIA decided that to truly test LSD's potential, they needed to use it on people who didn't know they were being drugged. Because apparently, ethics were optional when your boss reports directly to the president. One of the most infamous of these sub-projects was codenamed Operation Midnight Climax, and yes, that's the actual name the CIA used. It involved setting up fake brothels in San Francisco and New York, where unsuspecting men were given drinks secretly laced with LSD while CIA agents watched from behind two-way mirrors, taking notes. If you're wondering why, the official reason was to study how drugs could be used in interrogation and blackmail. The unofficial reason was probably because they could. Meanwhile, other agents were conducting their own little experiments, slipping LSD into co-workers' drinks during office parties just to see what would happen. One researcher, Dr. Frank Olson, was dosed without his knowledge at a retreat. Days later, he fell or was pushed from a hotel window in New York City. The CIA called it a suicide. His family called it something else. We'll get there later. For now, just know that by the mid-1950s, the CIA was knee-deep in LSD, paranoia, and questionable science. Gottlieb and his colleagues truly believed they might unlock a way to control the human mind to erase memories, implant suggestions, maybe even turn people into obedient assassins. Spoiler, none of that actually worked. LSD didn't turn out to be the magic truth serum or mind-control drug they hoped for. Instead, it made people laugh uncontrollably, question the nature of reality, and sometimes curl up under tables until the wallpaper stopped breathing. Not exactly a reliable interrogation tool. But even though MKUltra was failing, it was far from over. The CIA kept funding dozens of sub-projects, over 150 in total, spanning everything from hypnosis to psychic research to, well, more LSD, because once the government starts spending money, it's really hard to stop. Let's drift forward a bit to the 1960s, when LSD escaped the lab entirely and made its way into the public. And ironically, the same drug the CIA hoped would control people's minds ended up doing the exact opposite. If you're still awake, congratulations, you've just survived the CIA's most awkward science fair project. Now we're floating into the part where things get even weirder, because this is when the LSD that was meant for secret labs and interrogation rooms quietly slipped out into the world and accidentally launched an entire counterculture. By the late 1950s, the CIA had been pouring money into LSD research for nearly a decade. But here's the thing about handing out free acid samples to hundreds of scientists. Eventually, someone's going to take a little extra home for the weekend. And that's more or less how America's psychedelic revolution began, not with hippies in tie-dye, but with middle-aged psychiatrists in white coats, saying things like, "I wonder what would happen if I tried it myself." One of those psychiatrists was Dr. Harold Abramson, an allergist from New York who somehow convinced the CIA that he should be running LSD experiments. He didn't have much experience with psychiatry or with human ethics, but that didn't seem to bother anyone. He was given generous funding to study the effects of LSD on both patients and volunteers, sometimes with consent, sometimes less so. The CIA liked Abramson because he was discreet, and he liked the CIA because they paid for everything. It was a match made in bureaucratic heaven. But while Abramson was dosing people in Manhattan, across the country in California, LSD was being studied for more legitimate purposes, at least on paper. Researchers were curious whether it could help with alcoholism, depression, or trauma. One of these researchers was Dr. Humphrey Osmond, a British psychiatrist who coined the term psychedelic, meaning mind manifesting. Osmond was genuinely optimistic. He thought LSD could be used to help patients face their subconscious fears, and for a while it looked like he might be right. Some early studies showed that alcoholics who took LSD under supervision sometimes quit drinking after a single session. They described it as a profound spiritual experience, something that made them rethink their lives completely. Even Bill Wilson, the co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, quietly experimented with LSD and believed it could help people reach the same kind of enlightenment he talked about in recovery. But not everyone using LSD was as careful or noble as Osmond. Let's float over to Harvard in the early 1960s, where two psychologists, Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert, got their hands on some of the CIA's leftover acid, indirectly of course. They began running what they called the Harvard Psilocybin Project, experimenting with psychedelics on students and colleagues. At first it was academic. Then it became less so. Leary, who was charming, brilliant, and maybe a little too enthusiastic, started preaching LSD as a path to higher consciousness. "Turn on, tune in, drop out," he said later, which is roughly the opposite of what the CIA had in mind when they started this whole thing. Instead of creating obedient agents, LSD was inspiring people to question authority, reject consumerism, and paint their vans with flowers. It's honestly kind of poetic. The government's top secret weapon to control minds ended up helping people escape the system instead. Meanwhile, the CIA was starting to panic, not because of hippies yet, but because their own program was becoming a bureaucratic nightmare. Project MKUltra had grown into a hydra of sub-projects scattered across universities, hospitals, and private labs. So many people were involved that even the agency itself lost track of who was doing what. Some sub-projects were studying hypnosis combined with LSD. Others were experimenting on prisoners, psychiatric patients, and even soldiers, people who often had no idea what was being done to them. The records, when they existed at all, were vague. Many were destroyed in 1973 by order of, you guessed it, Sidney Gottlieb, just as the Watergate scandal was beginning to unravel the rest of Washington's secrets. But before the shredders started humming, M-Culture's shadow reached deep into American science. Universities like Stanford, Columbia, and McGill were all touched by CIA funding, usually through front organizations, so the researchers wouldn't realize who was paying them. One of the most infamous cases happened in Montreal under a psychiatrist named Dr. Donald Ewan Cameron. Now, Cameron was a respected doctor, head of the World Psychiatric Association, and by all accounts, a man who thought he was saving the world. His goal was to reprogram the human mind to erase psychosis by wiping away old memories and starting fresh, which, as you might imagine, went about as well as you'd expect. He used a combination of electroshock therapy, LSD, and something called psychic driving, which basically meant playing recorded messages on repeat for hours or days while patients were drugged and restrained. Some people forgot their families. Some forgot how to speak. It was horrifying. And it happened in a regular hospital in Canada, all funded quietly through MKUltra. And the saddest part, many of his patients were just there for anxiety or postpartum depression. They had no idea they were about to become test subjects in a Cold War nightmare. Back in the United States, other branches of MKUltra kept experimenting. Some agents believed LSD could be used in interrogations, making prisoners too disoriented to lie. Others thought it might reveal subconscious secrets. One project even explored whether LSD could make people assassinate without knowing it. Spoiler, it couldn't. But while all this was happening in labs and clinics, the LSD molecule itself was slipping further out of government control. Sandoz Laboratories stopped producing it commercially in 1965 after authorities grew nervous about how much was floating around. By then, though, chemists like Owsley Stanley had learned how to make it themselves, and not in laboratories but in bathtubs and basements. Owsley, a sound engineer for the Grateful Dead, was essentially the first large-scale underground LSD manufacturer. He saw himself as a kind of psychedelic patriot, flooding the counterculture with millions of doses. His product was famously pure. Owsley acid became almost mythical, and this is where the irony truly peaks. The CIA spent years trying to weaponize LSD, only for it to escape their grip and spark a social revolution built on peace, music, and self-discovery. The very thing they wanted to control minds ended up freeing them. By the mid-1960s, LSD was everywhere: college campuses, concerts, communes. The Beatles were experimenting with it. So were scientists, artists, and bored suburban kids. And the government, realizing they'd accidentally unleashed a cultural wildfire, tried desperately to put it back in the bottle. In 1966, the US officially banned LSD, making it a Schedule I drug. The CIA, by then, had quietly moved on to other experiments, some with hypnosis, others with sensory deprivation, and a few that were too strange even for them. But the damage, or maybe the enlightenment, had already been done. LSD had slipped into history, shaping art, music, politics, and psychology in ways no one could have predicted. Still, there were consequences the agency couldn't hide forever, and one of them was about to come crashing back in the form of a mysterious death that would finally blow the lid off MK. If you're still with me, congratulations, you've just survived a ride through Cold War paranoia, unlicensed chemistry, and some truly questionable science. Now we're refloating into one of the strangest and saddest chapters in this story, the death of a man named Frank Olson, and how his fall from a New York hotel window cracked open the secrets of MKUltra. So, let's start slow. Frank Olson wasn't some rogue spy or double agent. He was a scientist, a quiet, thoughtful man who worked for the U.S. Army's biological warfare laboratories at Fort Detrick, Maryland. His specialty was aerosol research, which, in plain terms, meant figuring out how to spread germs efficiently. Not exactly the most relaxing job, but in the early 1950s, this kind of work was considered patriotic. Germs were just another weapon in the Cold War toolbox. Olson's group often collaborated with the CIA on classified projects, and that's how he ended up crossing paths with Sidney Gottlieb, the same man orchestrating the LSD experiments we talked about earlier. Gottlieb admired Olson's technical skills, and Olson, for his part, was curious about the psychological side of warfare, how the mind could be influenced, manipulated, or broken. It was a professional curiosity that would soon turn personal and terrifying. In November 1953, Olson attended a small retreat at a cabin in the woods near Deep Creek Lake, Maryland. It was a routine meeting between CIA and Army researchers. Nothing unusual. The atmosphere was casual, dinners, drinks, and conversation. Then, during one of these cozy evenings, Gottlieb decided to conduct what he later described as an experiment in. He secretly slipped LSD into the after-dinner cocktails of several attendees, including Frank Olson. No one was told, no consent, no warning, just a let's see what happens kind of approach, which tells you everything about how casually MKUltra treated human experimentation. Within half an hour, the group began to feel strange. Some laughed, some grew paranoid, others sat in stunned silence. Olson's reaction, though, was different. He didn't just have a bad trip, he seemed to unravel. In the days that followed, his colleagues noticed he was agitated, withdrawn, and increasingly paranoid. He told friends he'd made a terrible mistake and wanted to resign from his job. He also said he was having trouble distinguishing reality from hallucination. The CIA grew concerned, though maybe not in the compassionate sense. Olson knew a lot about classified programs, including chemical and biological weapons testing. If he was cracking mentally, he was also a potential security risk. So, they decided to get him help. Gottlieb and another CIA officer escorted Olson to New York City, supposedly so he could see a psychiatrist familiar with government work. The doctor they chose was Harold Abramson, the same allergist and psychedelic researcher we met earlier, who happened to be on the CIA's payroll. Abramson met with Olson, prescribed him sedatives, and assured the agency he'd be fine. He wasn't fine. In the early hours of November 28, 1953, Olson fell officially, jumped from the window of his hotel room on the 13th floor of the Statler Hotel in Manhattan. His body was found on the sidewalk, pajamas still on. The CIA immediately called it a suicide, and his death was quietly filed away as a tragic incident. His family was told he'd been suffering from depression related to his work, the LSD detail that stayed secret for more than 20 years. But behind the scenes, even some within the CIA were uneasy. Gottlieb filed reports, meetings were held, and hush money quietly changed hands. Then the program carried on. Culture didn't stop. If anything, it expanded. Let's float forward now to the 1970s, a gentler decade for music, but not for secrets. After Watergate shattered public trust in government, journalists and Congress began digging into the intelligence community's more questionable activities. And buried in all those archives, someone stumbled across references to MKUltra, those vague, cryptic project codes that hinted at human experimentation, drugs, hypnosis, and other Cold War absurdities. In 1975, the Church Committee, a U.S. Senate investigation into CIA misconduct, publicly revealed the existence of MKUltra for the first time. The hearings were surreal. Senators sat there, stunned, as witnesses described how government scientists had been dosing people with LSD without their knowledge, running illegal experiments in hospitals and prisons, and even paying prostitutes to help collect data. The CIA admitted to destroying most of the MKUltra files 2 years earlier, but enough scraps survived to confirm that, yes, this had all actually happened. That's when the name Frank Olson resurfaced. His family, hearing his story retold in congressional testimony, realized the truth they'd been denied for decades, that Frank hadn't been just depressed, but had been drugged by his own government days before his death. They demanded answers. President Gerald Ford eventually met with the Olson family in the White House and issued a formal apology, one of the very few times a sitting U.S. president has apologized for a covert operation. The family received a financial settlement, and the case was declared closed. Except it wasn't. Years later, in the 1990s, Olson's son Eric had his father's body exhumed for a private autopsy. The results were unsettling. The coroner found signs of blunt force trauma to the skull, inconsistent with a simple fall suggesting Frank Olson may have been struck before he went out the window. It raised the possibility that his death hadn't been suicide at all, but something darker. The CIA, of course, denied any involvement. By then, most of the people who knew the truth were gone. Sidney Gottlieb had retired years earlier, living quietly on a farm, doing yoga, and raising goats because apparently, the man who ran the world's biggest mind control project just wanted a simple life in the end. So what really happened to Frank Olson? We'll probably never know for sure. Theories range from murder to panic-induced suicide. But the one thing that's clear is this. He was another casualty of a government experiment that blurred every ethical line imaginable. Let's float back for a moment. Think about it, how LSD began as an accident in a Swiss lab, a tool of curiosity, something beautiful and strange, and how it ended up in the hands of men who saw the human mind as a battlefield. They wanted to weaponize dreams. They tried to dissect consciousness. And instead, they opened a door they couldn't close. By the time the MKUltra files were shredded, the drug had already escaped into the culture, transformed art and music, and become a symbol of rebellion against the very institutions that had created it. The CIA lost control of LSD, and in doing so, maybe revealed something uncomfortable, that you can't engineer human consciousness. You can only experience it. Still, there's something quietly poetic about the arc of this story. A drug that started as a mind control experiment ended up teaching a generation about freedom, perception, and connection. And the people who tried to control it spent the rest of their lives denying they ever touched it. Let's drift to the last part of this story, where LSD leaves the shadows of secrecy and steps into the bright, swirling chaos of the 1960s, where it finally becomes what the CIA never intended, a symbol of peace. We've wandered through CIA safe houses, government labs, and a tragic hotel window. Now, let's float into a different kind of chaos, the one that smells like incense, hums with guitar feedback, and probably has someone talking about universal love in the corner. Because this is where LSD slips out of the shadows and transforms into the defining chemical of an entire decade. By the early 1960s, the Cold War paranoia that birthed MKUltra was still alive, but LSD had escaped the lab-coat world. It was out there circulating quietly among researchers, psychologists, artists, and curious souls who'd heard rumors about a chemical that could unlock the doors of perception. And if there's one thing about humanity, it's that we can't resist a good door. One of the people who walked straight through it was Aldous Huxley, the author of Brave New World. In 1954, Huxley published The Doors of Perception, a short, dreamy essay describing his experience with mescaline, a cousin of LSD. He wrote about seeing the divine in everyday objects, the folds of his pants, a vase of flowers, and suddenly everyone wanted to see what he saw. His book was a hit with intellectuals and artists, and when LSD arrived on the scene a few years later, it seemed like the logical next step in humanity's ongoing quest to look inside its own head. Meanwhile, on the other coast, our old friend Timothy Leary was spreading the psychedelic gospel from Harvard like a man possessed by enlightenment, or at least by a very enthusiastic research grant. After being fired from the university in 1963, Leary became a public figure, encouraging people to turn on, tune in, and drop out. And that phrase caught fire. To turn on meant to awaken your mind, to use psychedelics to access higher awareness. Tune in meant to harmonize with the world around you, and drop out. While that part made parents and politicians very nervous, it meant leaving behind the dull conformity of modern life. The CIA, somewhere deep in Langley, probably read those words and realized they decreated their worst nightmare, a generation of people deliberately doing the exact opposite of what they hoped LSD would achieve. By 1965, the psychedelic movement had momentum. College students were experimenting, artists were painting with glowing colors, and musicians were transforming sound itself. LSD found its rhythm in the music scene first. Where else? Because music was the easiest way to share an experience words couldn't capture. Bands like the Beatles, the Grateful Dead, and Jefferson Airplane began shaping what we now call psychedelic rock. The songs got longer, the lyrics weirder, and the album covers started to look like optical illusions drawn by someone halfway through a trip. And then there was Ken Kesey, author of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Before writing that novel, Kesey had actually volunteered for CIA-funded LSD experiments at Stanford. He loved it so much that he stole some of the drug, recruited a group of friends known as the Merry Pranksters, and started touring the country in a brightly painted school bus, handing out LSD like it was candy and holding acid tests, where people would gather to listen to music, trip together, and explore consciousness. That's how LSD stopped being a lab tool and became a lifestyle. At the center of it all was Owsley Stanley, the underground chemist who made sure there was enough acid to go around. Owsley wasn't just making small batches. He produced millions of doses, many of which powered the entire 1960s counterculture. His acid was pure, potent, and somehow symbolic. Each little tab carried a piece of rebellion, a challenge to the tidy, frightened America of the 1950s. And yet, for all the color and freedom, there was a shadow following behind. The government was watching. By 1966, LSD was starting to make the headlines, and not in a good way. News stories warned of bad trips, people jumping out of windows, and teenagers losing their minds. Much of it was exaggerated, but it was enough to alarm Washington. Congress quickly passed laws banning LSD, moving it from a research tool to an illegal substance. The irony, of course, was staggering. The same government that had once imported LSD by the kilo was now arresting people for having a few tabs in their pockets. Still, the genie wasn't going back in the bottle. The Summer of Love in 1967 was practically sponsored by LSD. Thousands of young people flooded San Francisco, turning Haight-Ashbury into the epicenter of psychedelic culture. Music festivals like Monterey Pop and, later, Woodstock became sprawling, colorful experiments in collective consciousness. And LSD was everywhere in the art, the conversations, even the politics. People who took it described seeing the world without divisions, without hierarchy, without fear. The rigid world of 1950s America's polished lawns, corporate gray suits, and Cold War certainties was dissolving into tie-dye chaos. But LSD didn't just change culture, it quietly rewired psychology too. In the late 1960s, therapists like Stanislav Grof began developing what they called psychedelic therapy. Structured LSD sessions used to help patients confront trauma, depression, or spiritual crises. Grof's work would later inspire modern approaches to therapy involving psilocybin and MDMA, decades after LSD was outlawed. Even today, some researchers credit those early experiments' ethical flaws, and all with opening new doors in neuroscience. LSD forced science to take consciousness seriously, even if it didn't understand it. Still, by the end of the 1960s, the party was ending. The counterculture had peaked, and what followed was a long, strange hangover. The US government doubled down on its anti-drug campaign. President Nixon called Leary the most dangerous man in America. LSD was pushed out of the public sphere, driven underground, and rebranded as a symbol of youthful irresponsibility. Research was halted for decades, and yet LSD never truly disappeared. It lingered quietly in art, in music, in spiritual movements, in the minds of those who'd glimpsed something beyond the ordinary. Even now, researchers are cautiously revisiting it, exploring its potential for treating PTSD, anxiety, and depression. It's strange, isn't it? The drug once feared as a weapon, worshipped as a sacrament, and banned as a menace is now being reconsidered as medicine. If there is a moral here, and I use that word loosely, it is that human curiosity always wins. We can try to control it, suppress it, or weaponize it, but it has a way of slipping out, changing shape, and finding new paths. So, from Albert Hoffman's bicycle ride in 1943 to the chaos of the 1960s and the labs of today, LSD's story is one long looping trip through science, politics, and the human mind. It's been a truth serum, a therapy tool, a party drug, and a spiritual compass, all depending on who held the dropper. Let's drift, now, toward the end of this story. In the final part we'll return to where it all began, to Albert Hoffman himself, the gentle Swiss chemist who lived long enough to see the world rediscover his strange little molecule. So, as if dosing unsuspecting citizens with LSD wasn't enough, the CIA decided to take the program in a new, even weirder direction. Around 1955, they launched something called Operation Midnight Climax, and yes, it's exactly as shady as it sounds. The agency rented apartments in San Francisco and New York, set them up with two-way mirrors, and hired prostitutes to lure men there for fun. The men were then secretly dosed with LSD while CIA agents sat behind the glass, clipboard in hand, taking notes like it was some avant-garde theater piece. This was all under the direction of George Hunter White, a former narcotics officer and general enthusiast of chaos. He wasn't a scientist, he was more like a party cop with government funding. White kept a journal where he bragged about his experiments, which mostly involved mixing LSD with sex, alcohol, and surveillance. His reasoning? To study how the drug affected behavior and truth-telling. In reality, it was closer to voyeurism with a federal budget. The apartments were decorated to look like something out of a noir film: velvet curtains, cheap paintings, dim lights, and strategically placed microphones. On the wall there'd be a mirror, but behind it was a CIA operative munching a sandwich and waiting to see how the LSD would play out. Sometimes the agent was White himself, drinking martinis while watching. He later wrote, "Where else could a red-blooded American boy lie? Kill, cheat, steal, rape, and pillage with the sanction and blessing of the all-highest charming guy." The logic was this: if LSD could make someone more suggestible or vulnerable, maybe it could be used to extract secrets or even control minds. But what the CIA mostly discovered was that LSD made people unpredictable. One subject would giggle uncontrollably for hours. Another would panic and try to jump out a window. Not exactly a reliable truth serum. Still, the agency kept experimenting. They tried to pair LSD with hypnosis. They tested it on prisoners, soldiers, students, and even each other. At one point, CIA employees would spike each other's drinks at the office just to see what would happen. It sounds like a frat house run by paranoid government agents. Meanwhile, in the real world, LSD was leaking out of the lab and onto the streets. Scientists like Timothy Leary, a Harvard psychologist who later became one of the faces of the counterculture, got hold of it through legitimate research channels. Leary believed LSD could expand consciousness and help people break free from societal conditioning. The CIA, ironically, had helped spread the very drug it wanted to control. By the early 1960s, LSD wasn't just a secret experiment. It was starting to shape music, art, and politics. The counterculture was brewing, and somewhere in Langley, a few CIA officers must have realized they'd accidentally helped create the psychedelic revolution. Let's drift a little deeper into that irony. Because while the CIA was trying to weaponize LSD, the rest of America was discovering it could be fun. Artists, musicians, writers, they were all experimenting. The Grateful Dead, Ken Kesey, Allen Ginsberg, and countless others were dropping acid and talking about higher consciousness, while the agency's scientists were still trying to figure out how to make someone confess to espionage. And then there was the San Francisco connection. The same city where Operation Midnight Climax ran its sleazy tests became one of the spiritual homes of the psychedelic movement. From government-funded prostitution traps to hippie communes, it was all happening in the same few square miles. The CIA's paranoia only grew. Reports started circulating that the Soviets might also be testing LSD for mind control. Never mind that they weren't, it was enough to keep the funding flowing. The agency poured millions into MKUltra and its sub-projects, each one stranger than the last. There were experiments on sensory deprivation, sleep deprivation, and electroshock therapy combined with LSD. Some subjects were institutionalized patients who had no idea they were part of an experiment. Others were volunteers who thought they were helping science but wound up psychologically shattered. The most infamous of these cases involved a man named Frank Olson, a biochemist who worked with the army and was secretly dosed with LSD by his CIA colleagues at a retreat in 1953. He suffered a breakdown, became paranoid, and 9 days later Falloor was pushed from a hotel window in New York. Officially it was ruled a suicide, but decades later, his family received a settlement and an apology from the US government. Whether it was guilt or PR damage control remains debatable. The Olsen case was one of the first cracks in the wall of secrecy around MKultra, but the program didn't stop, it just went quieter. The agency learned to bury its weirdest projects under layers of bureaucracy and codenames, with documents labeled for internal use only and project terminated. By the late 1960s, LSD was officially illegal, and the cultural revolution it inspired had become a political headache. The very drug the CIA once thought could control people had instead made them question authority. That's one of those ironies that probably kept some old spy masters awake at night. Let's drift into the 1970s next, when the curtain finally started to lift and the public got a glimpse of just how bizarre the whole operation had been. So by the time the 1970s rolled around, the CIA's little chemistry project had ballooned into something that even the agency itself barely understood. MKultra had spawned 149 subprojects, each with its own codename, budget, and pet scientist. Some dealt with hypnosis, others with biological agents. A few just experimented with behavioral modification, which is a nice bureaucratic way of saying we try to mess with people's heads. But here's the thing, no one in the public had any clue. The program was buried under layers of security classifications. The participants were often sworn to secrecy, or too confused or too traumatized to talk. It wasn't until 1973, 2 decades after it began, that the truth started to slip out. And it began, as many strange government stories do, with a paper shredder. When Watergate hit and the political tide turned against the intelligence community, then CIA Director Richard Helms realized that MKultra was a liability. So, in a move that would make any good spy proud, he ordered all MKultra files destroyed. Thousands of documents gone, decades of evidence erased in a few days. Except, as it happens, not all of them. A few years later, in 1977, a batch of 20,000 financial documents was found in a forgotten storage box. These were budget records, receipts, memos, invoices, mundane, boring paper trails that had somehow survived the purge. And from these scraps, investigators began to piece together what the CIA had really been up to. That's when the public finally heard about MK. The revelations came out during the Church Committee hearings and the Rockefeller Commission to government investigations that were supposed to bring transparency to U.S. intelligence abuses. For the first time, Americans saw the outlines of a secret program where the CIA had drugged, hypnotized, and manipulated its own citizens, all in the name of national security. Senators sat in disbelief as witnesses described the LSD experiments, the mind control attempts, and the moral black hole that was Operation Midnight Climax. It sounded like bad science fiction, but it was real. The surviving documents revealed that the CIA had paid universities, hospitals, and research centers to carry out their experiments. Many of the researchers didn't even know they were working for the agency. The front organizations were designed to look like independent foundations, legit, respectable, and completely unaware that their funding came from Langley. One psychiatrist at McGill University, Dr. Donald Ewan Cameron, became infamous for his work under MK. He tried to reprogram patients by combining massive electroshock treatments with LSD and sensory deprivation. His patients, who came in for mild anxiety or depression, often left mentally broken, with erased memories or childlike behavior. Decades later, many of them would sue the Canadian government for allowing it to happen. The hearings also brought back the story of Frank Olson, the biochemist who died after being dosed without his knowledge. His family was invited to the White House, where President Ford personally apologized. The government gave them a $750,000 settlement and promised transparency. Of course, transparency in CIA terms usually means we'll tell you what we already know, you know. Still, the apology was something. And the Olsen case became a symbol of how far the agency had gone and how little oversight it had faced. After MKultra was exposed, Congress passed new laws restricting human experimentation without consent. The CIA promised it would never happen again. And for once, it seems that might have been true, or at least they got better at hiding it. But the damage was done. LSD, once seen as a miracle of modern psychiatry, was now tainted by its association with espionage and manipulation. It left behind a bizarre legacy, a government that had tried to use a mind-expanding drug to control minds, only to watch it spark a cultural revolution that questioned every kind of control. Let's drift into the aftermath, because the story doesn't end with MKultra being shut down. It lingers in conspiracy theories, in declassified documents, in the lingering mistrust between the public and the intelligence community. Even today, MKultra is a sort of ghost story that floats through American culture. It's referenced in movies, TV shows, and the occasional late-night forum thread where someone swears they found proof it never really ended. And maybe that's the strangest part of all. The CIA's obsession with controlling minds didn't just change science, it changed belief. It left people wondering what else the government might be hiding, what else might be whispered about behind closed doors. It became the blueprint for every secret experiment story that followed. But if there's one thing the MKultra files show, it's that the truth is rarely cinematic. It's dull, bureaucratic, and deeply human. Scientists making poor ethical choices, agents chasing impossible goals, paperwork, paranoia, and the occasional LSD hangover. By the late 1970s, MK Ultra was officially over. The CIA moved on to new priorities, new programs. LSD had escaped into the wider world, no longer a secret weapon but a symbol of freedom and rebellion. And the rest of us were left with a strange mix of fascination and unease, knowing that, for a while, the world's most powerful spy agency thought the key to control might be found in a little square of blotter paper. Let's close our eyes on that image for tonight. A man in a gray suit, sitting in a fluorescent-lit office, watching reports pile up about hallucinogenic chaos he can no longer contain. Somewhere, the mirror reflects his own creation back at him, and maybe that's the real moral of this sleepy little story. You can try to control the mind, but in the end the mind always finds a way to wander.